About to leave, already packing. Come with me, I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know. About to see the world in action, what we can be, life with no distractions. We'll get away, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free with me. Let's be free with Not looking back, eyes on the freeway, Bonnie and Clyde, a classic cliche. We're on the run, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free.
Good evening, everybody. It's John here from Tutor to You. Welcome you to another live stream for A-Level Geography. And tonight we're discussing fires in nature risk management. Big warm welcome to those of you who are joining us live. Lovely to see you as always. And if you want to participate in our activities as we go along, we would love to hear from you. Love to see what you've got to say, and please do use the YouTube chat window if you're going to do that. If you're watching us on replay, which I know hundreds if not thousands of people have been doing so in recent weeks, warm welcome to you as well. And of course you've got all the time in the world, and you can pause the video and have a look at our questions in your own time. Massive further welcome to Catherine in the middle of the screen and Brendan on the right screen. Good evening, both of you. Okay?
Good evening. Great form, thanks, John.
Good
Brilliant
stuff. Good to see you both. Catherine, do you want to tell us a little bit about what we're looking at tonight?
Right, okay, so we have been looking at physical geography, and we, in our last session, were looking at some different aspects related to hazards. And so today we're going to think about wildfires, a really exciting hazard to look at because it doesn't feature in the GCSE courses. So when A-level students look at wildfires, this is a whole new area and so important when we think about different stories we hear in the news. So really excited to be doing this session today.
We're always really excited, Catherine, but we're particularly excited.
Even more
tonight.
excited.
Brilliant stuff. Okay, are we ready? Shall we get cracking?
Let's do it. Okay, so just a little warm-up activity here. This is a Kim's game, and it has items on the screen which relate to hazards. And what's going to happen is the items will start to disappear, and then they will pop back up on the screen with one missing. And what you need to do is see if you can identify which one it is that's missing. So let's take a look. So we've got here some of the different terms that are related to hazards and linked in the session that we did previously, but also some of the different terms that are going to be useful for today's session. Now, this is a really nice little activity for helping with your revision. This idea of looking at the words and then taking them away and see what you can remember. Lots of different techniques you can use to try and remember these important terms. I've heard about people thinking about where things could be in a house, or thinking about stories involving words when you're trying to learn key terms like this. So we've just got 2 left on the screen there. So try to be holding these key terms in your mind. And there goes the last one. So now let's see. Do you know which item is missing? So have a look at this. And if you could type into the chat box to tell me which one you think it is that is missing. Wow, some of you are quick. That is fantastic. Right, well done. Okay, so let's have the reveal and see. Yes, you were right. Well done. So this was ignition. So we have these different terms here: hazard management cycle, the park model, adaptation, mitigation, that we've looked at in previous sessions. But what we're going to be bringing in today is thinking about ideas like ignition and thinking about fuel, thinking about human agency. These are some ideas we're going to be developing in this session. So over to Brendan to find out more.
Thanks, Catherine. So we're going to start by having a look at the conditions that favour intense wildfires. Let's have a look at the kind of key things that do that. Vegetation type is really important. So dense vegetation provides more fuel. This is why one management technique is to create fire breaks, because it actually stops the fire spreading so easily. Also, some vegetation is naturally more flammable than other vegetation, which brings us to the fuel characteristics, the second point. The flammable material in the area. It's got to be dry enough. It doesn't have to be completely dry, but dry enough. And there has to be enough of it. Third point is climate and recent weather. So factors such as temperatures, precipitation and winds will affect the flammability and the type of vegetation growing. So for example, a period of drought will increase the chance of the fuel becoming dry enough. And this actually happened earlier this year in Western Scotland, not a place you would think of as being characteristic for wildfires, but they certainly had them there. Wind speed and direction is often a crucial factor once a fire has got going. We might add that the humidity of the air is also important. And the final point here, fire behaviour, how the fire ignites, how the flames develop, and how the fire spreads. And there are 3 different types of fire, for example. Surface fires, which occur, right down at ground level. Crown fires, which spread through the canopy. And then the somewhat confusingly named ground fires, which are also called, perhaps more accurately called, underground or subsurface fires that burn through the ground, such as peat. And a good example of that is surface wildfires started in Siberia this year from the previous year's subsurface fires that had not gone out. They just smouldered on through the winter and then sort of came alive again at the surface at the end of the winter. Let's move on to have a look at the fire triangle. If your school has ever had a visit from the fire brigade to advise about how to improve your school's resilience to fire, or if you've ever had lessons about fire in science, you may well be familiar with the fire triangle. So fire depends on 3 essential ingredients, like a stool with 3 legs. So those 3 ingredients are oxygen, heat, and fuel. If you take one of these ingredients away, the fire will collapse or stop. Now, in a wildfire situation out in the open, this is often a really massive challenge. Let's move on to have a look at which of these is most at risk from fire.
Okay, so we've got there two pictures, and often in A-level exams, you might get given things like photographs and different resources, and it's really important that you really look at those carefully. So if we have a look, we've got a mixed forest in Thailand in the dry season, and we have a eucalyptus forest in Australia with a fire break. So just spend a moment and just look at those two images and think about, if you were in an exam, what would you be looking at in these pictures, and how does this relate to what Brendan's just been talking about? Now, one of the things that I would really advise that you do if you are looking at things like photographs in an exam is jot down some notes around them, add some annotations, because that might help you crystallize your thinking. So, for example, in this mixed forest in Thailand, it's in the dry season. Think about what Brendan was saying there about, if you've got something that's dry, it doesn't have to be, bone dry, but if it's dry, it's more likely that it's going to be flammable. Look at the ground in that picture. You can see the fallen leaves. And so they are going to be providing fuel. And then we've got the trees there. Their branches are interlinking. They're growing towards each other. And that's going to mean the fire would be able to spread really easily. Whereas when we look at the eucalyptus forest in Australia, Brendan mentioned earlier the idea of the fire break, having a gap in between. And the idea is to make it so that the fire can't travel so easily. Now, this isn't going to be infallible. There could be strong winds that are blowing sparks, and the fire could cross the fire break. But hopefully the fire break would mean that the fire would be slowed down or even couldn't cross it. However, if you have a bit of knowledge of different types of forests, you might know that eucalyptus forests can burn very, very fiercely. So when you are looking at an A-level question involving pictures like this, really look at what you've got, add some annotations before you start writing your answer, and you can start thinking about things like the fuel available, management techniques have been put into place. So that takes us on now to how these fires actually start. Now, we've got two terms here. We have got the term natural agency, which means that the fire is starting because of natural causes. And by far the most common natural cause of wildfires is lightning strikes. But we also have human agency playing a role. And the main reasons why fires start because of human activity are things like when there is a planned burn. So people might choose to burn an area of forest to clear land for farming or to tidy it up. But that might get out of control, and that could be a real problem. Sparks from power lines is another big issue. People lighting campfires and leaving them unattended or smouldering. Cigarettes, another problem. It could be that there is equipment. So maybe there's, for example, a pump or an engine and it malfunctions and it sparks. That can also be a problem. And then, of course, we have arson. And arson is when people are deliberately setting fire to an area. And that is a very, very serious crime. So a little challenge here now for you. Now, you have probably heard in the news about different places around the world that are affected by wildfires. And like Brendan was saying earlier, actually, places you might not even suspect of having issues with wildfires, like Scotland, can have these issues. But we often hear about the USA and problems with wildfires. So what I'm going to ask you to do now is look at these 6 states from the United States of America and think which order would you put them in from the most wildfires in 2020 to the least. Now, these are the top 6 states, and there's at least one of these that I was really surprised to see. So can you pop in the chat box which ones you think would go first? So pop down the number and then put the numbers going in order from the most wildfires to the least. So let's see what you can come up with. Yeah, I thought some people would be guessing straight away at California. Yeah, that is going to be a high up one, isn't it? We hear a lot about the wildfires in California. Let's see which ones you think come after California. Yeah, some interesting answers coming up now. Fantastic. Okay, let's reveal our answers for this one. So, yeah, you were right. California is coming out on top, followed by Texas and Arizona. Those didn't surprise me so much because those are places that, in my mind, I think, yeah, they're going to be quite dry. But the one that surprised me was Florida, because I've been to Florida. You've got large areas of wetlands, like the Everglades in Florida, but still you've got places which are suffering from wildfires as well. So this just shows it isn't just obvious places, and more places around the world are experiencing wildfires as time goes on. Okay, so over now to Brendan to think about the impacts of these fires.
Thanks, Catherine. So we're looking at the impacts of fires, and there is a little bit of retrieval here and applying your learning from GCSE or even earlier, because we're looking at the primary and secondary impacts. So it's as well to be aware of the fact that some impacts are what we call primary, they happen as a direct result of the fire, and some are secondary, they're indirectly related. So the key words there are direct and indirect. So some of the direct impacts would be loss of life, injuries, smoke inhalation, destruction of property and possessions, the air pollution that lasts for perhaps a little while with particulates in the atmosphere. So remember, the key word is direct. Secondary impacts would be things like homelessness, soil erosion and landslides, and loss of income. You might expect soil erosion to be, to do with this, because if trees are burned and the foliage disappears, there's nothing to hold the soil together. So that can actually be a secondary impact later on, especially if rain follows a fire. Let's move on to have a look at the impacts in a different way. We're looking at them using the SEEP acronym: social, economic, environmental, and political. And once again, we're retrieving learning that I'm sure you will have considered in earlier years, maybe even as early as year 7. I certainly covered this with my year 9s the other day. So we've got social impacts, things like health and education. Economic impacts, that's really to do with jobs and incomes and those sorts of things, loss of property. Environmental impacts on habitats and the environment. So for example, ecosystem disruption that affects the equilibrium of networks between the living and non-living things in the area which has been suffering from the wildfire. And then there are political considerations or political impacts. So for example, an important subgroup of this would be those concerning stakeholders and interest groups. So having looked at the impacts, we're now going to do another activity. It's called the bubble quiz. If you haven't done this before, it's a multiple choice activity, but the key difference is that any number of the possible answers, there are 4 possible answers to each question. So any number of those possible answers could be correct. Could be none of them, 1 of them, 2 of them, 3 of them, or all 4 of them. So let's have a look at the first question of the bubble quiz. The question is, which of these factors favour intense wildfires? So just put your answer or answers, because it could be 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4 of these answers that's correct, and just jot that in the chat with the letters. Okay, I think we have at least one correct answer. Let's have a look at the correct answers. So if we go back to the fire triangle, B, C, and D, they're the correct answers, support the fuel and oxygen. But A removes the heat, so A would not contribute to intense wildfires for that reason. Let's look at question number 2. Which of these elements are in the fire triangle? Again, jot your answer or answers in the chat. Okay, great. We've got several correct answers here. That's excellent. So the correct answers are oxygen and fuel. And once again, we're referring to the fire triangle. The 3 key elements are oxygen, fuel, and heat. Now, drought and wind do not count here, although they're not actually those things. They're not oxygen, fuel, and heat. They can, of course, support elements of the fire triangle, but they're not the fire triangle itself. Let's move on to question 3. Which of these causes are due to natural agency? Possible answers: lightning strikes, sparks from power lines, volcanic activity, or arson. Which of those, if any, are correct? Have a little think about that. Guess if you're not sure. Okay, let's move on. I think someone's got this, so let's move on. The correct answers there would be A and C, lightning strikes and volcanic activity, because natural agency means anything not linked to human activity. So sparks from power lines and arson, that's when a fire is deliberately started by someone, or of course human actions. And incidentally, we might mention here that by far the most common cause of wildfires in the world is lightning. And there have always been wildfires on the planet way before there were human beings. Let's look at question 4. Which of these are primary impacts? Which of these are primary impacts? Is it any of them, none of them, 1, 2, 3 of them? Is it loss of income, soil erosion, loss of life, or homelessness? Make your choices or choice. And good. And the correct answer is loss of life. That's the only one of those that we would count as a primary impact. The others would classify routinely as secondary. Question 5. Which of these are social impacts? Which of these are social impacts? Is it 1 of them, 2 of them, 3 of them, 4 of them, or none of them? So 1 of them is heavy rain after the fire causes flooding. The local mayor is accused of acting too slowly. Ancient trees are burned. Tourists don't visit. Make your selection. Not seeing any correct answers yet. There might be 1 coming through. Good. Excellent. Let's have a look at the correct answer. Absolutely. 0 was the correct answer. None of them are correct because heavy rain would be an environmental impact. The local mayor would be a political impact. Ancient trees would count as an environmental impact, and tourists not visiting would count as an economic impact. You would lose business from tourism. Okay, that here endeth the bubble quiz. Back to Catherine.
Thank you very much, Brendan. I do love the bubble quiz, the way little bubbles dance are on the screen. So let's have a little think now about the response to wildfires. And we can think about the short term, we can think about the long term. So in the short term, we've got evacuation. So if people are warned that the fire is coming towards their area, then they may well evacuate, move out of the area, move to somewhere safer. But also the fire might be sprayed. And there's a photograph up on the screen there showing the helicopter going over that's dropping down. It could be powder, it could be water that's being dropped down. And you can also see the image there of the firefighters spraying at ground level. It could be that it's the fire itself that's being sprayed. It could be areas ahead of it to try and tackle it. And one of the interesting things about when things like powder are used is that's trying to stop the fire having access to the oxygen, which is so much needed as part of the fire triangle. So another thing could happen is that there might be a fire break created. So people might go ahead of the fire and clear trees, trying to stop the fire from being able to travel. And that can be particularly important if the fire is approaching a house. People might be cutting trees down to try and make it so that the fire isn't jumping from the trees to the house itself. But after the fire has been quenched, it's gone out, there is going to be a need for rebuilding. And that is going to be communities that need to be rebuilt, and also the infrastructure. So things like roads and bridges, the telegraph poles, the wires are on, they're going to have burned. So there's going to be a significant rebuilding project needed. But that can also be a time when risk management strategies can be implemented. So the idea is that things can be done so that if a fire were to strike again, it would not be so serious. So let's have a look at some of those. So preparedness, the first one here, that's all about having plans in place. So it could be that a settlement has an evacuation plan. There might be an emergency number to call, because of course one of the really important things in managing this is going to be catching the fire early. If it's caught while it's still small, it's going to be a lot easier to put out than if it's really spread. So having an emergency number that everybody knows to be able to report the fires is going to be something that could really make a difference. And then we've got the idea of mitigation. So we talked just now, I mentioned about people thinking about their own homes, clearing the forest around it. Instead of having to do that in the middle of a crisis, people could do that in advance. People could clear the forest around their homes to make sure that they've got a nice clear area, so that if there were a fire, it would be less likely to affect their property. And then we've got the idea of prevention, trying to stop wildfires igniting in the first place, reducing that risk. So an example of this would be having very careful rules for campfires, making sure people are really clear on how important it is to make sure that those fires are properly extinguished. And then there's adaptation. And hazard mapping is something that is just fantastic to look into and find out more about, because there are some incredible hazard maps being produced, giving an idea of the relative risk in different locations, so that people can make decisions about where it may be safe to develop a settlement, where it would be better to maybe leave an area for leisure rather than building on it. And there's also been so much that's been done in recent years on building design, making sure that buildings are as resilient as they can possibly be to help communities cope with wildfires. So this links into something we've looked at in a previous session, the hazard management cycle. So we can see here, pre-disaster, in an area, people are going to be thinking about the risks they could be facing. Now, what's happened in recent years is that there's been a lot of urbanization, and as urban areas grow, people start moving into areas maybe on the edge of cities, which are starting to go into woodland areas. But also people might think that it's a very nice place to live. They might think, oh, I live outside the city, I live in the forests, it would be lovely. But when those settlements are developing, if they are being risk assessed and people are starting to think about mitigation and preparedness, that can mean that if that fire hits, things may not be anywhere near as bad as they could have been. So you can see here on the diagram that a fireball hitting, and this is the point where all that preparation can really pay off, with people being warned and evacuating and people being saved. Hopefully plans have been put in place for that so that people can have immediate assistance. But then people are going to be thinking, right, what damage has been done? And the communities might need ongoing assistance. Even after the flames are out, people are still going to need help and support. And then we start moving through to the end of that response phase, with the services in the area starting to be restored, and people are out of that initial stage of threat. The next section here on the hazard management cycle is looking at after the disaster. This is where the rebuilding is happening, like we talked about just now, the long-term responses, and the economy and the society will hopefully start to recover, and the area will be able to be developed, hopefully, in a way that means that there is going to be more mitigation, more prevention, which will reduce the danger in the future. It will reduce the risk when it comes to future hazards. So this hazard management cycle seems to come up a lot in A-level questions. Really worth making sure you're clear about it. Over to Brendan now to think about a very important model, the park model.
Many thanks, Catherine. So these theoretical frameworks are very important at A-level, because you have to not just be aware of them, but to what extent do they apply to particular situations? And that's that to what extent question is always a very, very important one at A-level. So the park model, we're going to try and apply that with the context of wildfires. Let's just have a look at it first so we make sure we know what it is. So it's also known as the disaster response curve, and it's named after a geographer, in fact, called Chris Park, who worked at Lancaster University for some years. He's now Professor Emeritus there. And as with any chart or model, you have to understand what the axes mean. So let's look at those. The y-axis embraces three variables: quality of life, economic activity, and social stability. You can see the arrows on the left-hand side. The x-axis shows the passage of time, and lots of models do that. They show the passage of time. So what are the stages? The first stage is where we have what we call pre-disaster. In some models, some manifestations of this model, you will see it called stage 1. So pre-disaster is before the event, when the quality of life, economy, social stability are all normal, chugging along, everyone's in a normal situation. Then the hazard event occurs, and the hazard event, when it actually occurs, everything is still actually normal. It hasn't quite deteriorated yet, but it will. You can be rest assured about that. So we move on to looking at the key parts of the model next: relief, rehabilitation, reconstruction. So relief is the next stage. You can see this along the bottom of the diagram there. What we sometimes call stage 3 is the immediate aftermath of the hazard event. So the emphasis here has to be on searching for people who may be trapped or may be injured, rescuing them, and care. So first aid. At this point, quality of life, economic activity, and social stability have deteriorated very rapidly. And this episode can last from days to weeks, months, or even sometimes years, depending on the magnitude of the event, but also the level of development and the level of resilience of a place. That could be a region or a country. The one country that's often cited as being somewhat stuck in this stage is Haiti, since they had an earthquake in 2010. That was, 10 or 11 years ago. New Zealand, on the other hand, which had an earthquake around a similar time, but it was 2011, recovered much, much more quickly because its level of development, level of resilience was higher. Rehabilitation is stage 4. This is when aid or relief strategies have become more established and organized. Again, this may take varying times to occur. The key point is that the strategies here are beginning to have an impact on those y-axis criteria. Quality of life, economic activity, and or social stability are all improving. Reconstruction, sometimes called stage 5, this is when long-term responses kick in, including things like rebuilding of housing, rebuilding of infrastructure like bridges and railways and so on. Economic recovery can take place. There's the re-establishment of social fabric. Once again, the time frame here is variable. But the key point is that by this stage, life is returning back to the standard it was before the hazard event. And it may even be better. More of that in a moment. Remember that a model is a generalization of what happens. It's usually based on observations of things that have happened over many years for many different types of hazard. So the reality will always tend to be different. You expect it to not be identical to this, but the model provides us with a useful schema which helps us to clarify our understanding. So, as I said to you before, at A level, you will be expected not just to understand this model, but to assess, evaluate, or discuss its applicability to actual events you've studied. So questions might start with those magic words, to what extent? To help you a little bit with that, I'll just outline a couple of weaknesses and strengths. Weaknesses of this model are that you need to be aware that it doesn't comfortably show or accommodate different levels of development or hazard resilience. On the other hand, it's got great strengths. It's useful for comparing different types of hazard events by looking at the different curve steepness for different hazard events. Okay, let's have a look at the positive impacts of wildfires, because I did mention that sometimes, things may recover to a stage that's better than before, or at least as good as before. So one thing we must all remember, of course, impact are not all bad, or not always bad. Impact is a neutral word. It can be positive or it can be negative. You need to qualify the impact. With wildfires, there are, of course, many negative impacts, but there are also positive impacts. Perhaps communities will learn from the experience. They may, to coin a phrase, build back better. I know that's a slightly pejorative term, but that's a phrase that's sometimes used. You can see that indicated on the diagram. Wildfires, as I mentioned earlier on, are older than humanity. They've always existed. So consequently, ecosystems are actually not too bad at dealing with them in certain circumstances. Many plants and animals are so well adapted, even to the extent that they may actually need fire to help them with their reproductive processes. There are plants that can tolerate fire. They're called pyrophytes, and that's from the Greek word for fire, pyros, and phyte, plant. Examples of those would be the baobab tree, banksia, and other plants. So pyrophytes are plants that can tolerate fire, and they actually need it for their life cycle. Let's move on to a little activity based on these ideas. So the activity is this. You have 5 sentences written out here, and I will leave them, I think, for you to read them yourselves. You don't have to do an awful lot in terms of writing in the chat, because if you look, each sentence has a number. So all you have to do is to just type the correct sequence of those sentences. So I'm just going to give you a moment to read them, and then type in the chat what you think is the correct order of those sentences, which are numbered on the left 1 through to 5. So have a moment to read them now. Okay, got a few interesting answers coming through. Let's just see if any of those have got the correct sequence. Make your guesses. Okay, let's have a look at the answers. The correct sequence is sentence 4, then 3, then 2, then 1, then 5. We start with 4. More people have built homes in forests, so the risk of being affected by wildfires has increased in many areas. So you've got an increase in what we call vulnerable populations. You may have studied Degg's model, which looks at that. Second sentence to use is number 3, hazard mapping, etc. And this is because it's about preparation. The third sentence we're going to use is number 2. As well as preparing, homeowners can take action to mitigate against fire damage, such as clearing a space around their property. And this is mitigation. The fourth sentence we'll use is number 1. Despite mitigation, a fire may mean a community has to evacuate. Firefighters will tackle the blaze and later rebuilding will begin. This is evacuation of the community. And the final sentence, number 5, the rebuilding stage is an opportunity to implement risk management strategies, and this phrase we heard about earlier on, to hopefully build back better. So well done if you got those.
So when we are looking at wildfires, you need to make sure you have studied an example, and you need to look at the impact and the human responses as evidenced by a recent wildfire event. So a recent wildfire event that you could use for this, you could look at the Black Saturday bushfires in the state of Victoria. So look at that photograph there, showing the impacts of those bushfires. So you might have studied that particular bushfire. You might have studied a bushfire that was in California. There are many different places that you could look at, but it's really important you have really good knowledge of one of them. And this is needed specifically in the AQA A-level specification, that there's this big focus on wildfires. So how might this look in the exam? Now, I mentioned earlier that there are a lot of questions seem to come up about things like the hazard management cycle and the park model. So you need to make sure you have really good knowledge of those and are able to apply that knowledge in different contexts. So we've got a question here. An understanding of the hazard management cycle is vital in improving understanding and therefore management of wildfires. To what extent do you agree with this view? Let's think how we'd break that down. So first of all, we've got the command, to what extent? This is a question where we are evaluating. So we have the statement, and then you need to say, how much do you agree with the view? Do you agree? So would you say to a great extent, to some extent? You need to think about your level of agreement with the statement. Right. So, and then we're thinking about the content here. So you need to be thinking about the hazard management cycle. So remember, we looked at that just now, the one that looked a bit like a wheel with a little sort of like, fireball hurtling into it. So you need to be showing that you have understanding of that hazard management cycle. But what are you going to do with it? Let's see the next bit. Right. So what you're looking at is, if someone understands the hazard management cycle, is that vital to improve their understanding and management of wildfires? So what's really important with these 20-mark questions is making sure that you are really focusing in on exactly what they want you to do. So you're thinking, okay, someone knows about the hazard management cycle. Do they need to know about that to be able to understand and manage wildfires? And then you need to be tackling the to what extent part of this answer. And you would not believe how many questions like this I've marked where students get mixed up with the hazard. So this is talking about wildfires, and it can be very easy to slip into thinking about tropical storms or think about volcanic hazards or think about seismic hazards, because in the topic for AQA, you've got all these different examples of hazards that you'll have been studying. But this is specifically in relation to wildfires. And as Brendan said earlier, you need to be able to apply these models to the different types of hazard. And it would be really, really helpful in answering this question if you used the example, like the one that we looked at just now, to support your answer. So you're thinking about the hazard management cycle. Do we need to understand it so we can understand and manage wildfires? And then coming up with a conclusion as to how much we agree with this view. Now, the specification says that you need to explore the impact and response to one recent wildfire event, but I would recommend that it is good to be aware of more than one event. So wildfires are going to vary from place to place. It's going to be very different if you've got a wildfire affecting Scotland to if you've got one in a very dry area of Australia. The impacts and the responses are going to also differ, and they change over time. What happened in the past tended to be much more destructive because people hadn't learnt and they hadn't developed the technology. So you might find that if you look at a wildfire from a while ago, it might have had very serious impacts that just wouldn't be happening so much nowadays. Or there might be some areas where things have gone backwards, and actually the way the woodlands have been managed means that the impacts have got worse. So it's a really good idea to have your one recent wildfire event that you know very well, but to also have this awareness of other places. If you can show that understanding, that you realise that not all wildfires are the same, then that is going to really help you get those top marks. And you can also link this to human geography processes such as urban sprawl. So as urban areas are sprawling out into the forests, this means that we have got more likelihood that people's houses are going to be affected by those wildfires. So go beyond the basics of the specification to make sure you can really show off in the exam how much you know and really look at these issues in some depth. Now, if you are looking for more information to revise the hazards topic, there are a couple of great resources that you can find from the Tutor to You website. So there's the hazards revision study notes, which you can download, and there's also a hazards court resource pack that you can see pictured on the screen there. So remember, take a look at the Tutor to You website, all sorts of different resources there to help you with all the different topics that we have been looking at over these weeks.
Always lots of help from Tutor to You. That's absolutely correct, Catherine. Thank you for that. As always, absolutely fascinating stuff. Massive thank you to those of you who have been taking part and giving your answers and suggestions through the chat window tonight. Some really good stuff there. Some correct and some not so correct, but I think plenty of learning take place. Certainly, I've learnt loads tonight. So the Siberian fires, then, Brendan, they were actually caused from fires from previous years. Did I understand that correct?
Yep, subsurface smouldering, and it can give rise to fires, even though they were covered over by snow and ice and intensely cold temperatures. Underground, those fires were still smouldering.
And is that common, or is that something that's come about more because of global warming?
I don't know whether it's. I think it may be linked to it in some indirect. I'm not an expert on that, but certainly that wouldn't be helping.
Right. And then the other one, Catherine, was Florida. Florida have lots of wildfires as well. I would never have guessed that. I wouldn't have known that as well.
No, I've been to Florida a few times, and it's always seemed pretty humid, pretty damp, and so I was really surprised by that.
Yeah. Brilliant stuff. Well, like I say, thanks to everybody who's taken part tonight, and massive thank you, obviously, to Catherine and Brendan for delivering that really interesting stuff. Don't forget, of course, that the PowerPoint slides that we've been using tonight, they are available to download immediately, and you can watch this video all over again if you want to, and follow the brilliant pieces of exam advice that Catherine and Brendan have been giving you. So, without further ado, I'll say good night and look forward to seeing you all on another occasion. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.